You people always try to bend the rules. The words sliced through gate K-12 like shrapnel, loud enough for every passenger in Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 to freeze mid-conversation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez felt her husband's hand tighten on her arm as gate agent Jennifer Walsh pointed an accusatory finger at his carry-on bag, her voice dripping with contempt. What Jennifer didn't know was that the quiet man she just insulted owned 45% of Pacific Airways. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the gate area's worn carpet. It was 4:55 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Terminal 3 reeked of stale coffee disinfectant and the desperation of delayed travelers. Passengers were sprawled across every available surface like refugees from some corporate disaster, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of smartphone screens. The air conditioning wheezed through dusty vents, fighting a losing battle against the heat generated by hundreds of frustrated bodies packed into a space designed for half that number. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stretched her arms over her head, feeling vertebrae pop after 16 straight hours in an operating room. If this flight gets delayed again, I'm going to prescribe myself a vacation. From vacations, she murmured, her voice carrying the exhaustion that only comes from saving lives while running on 3 hours of sleep and hospital coffee. Her husband, James Carter, looked up from his tablet where he'd been reading acquisition reports that could wait but probably wouldn't. His eyes scanned the chaotic boarding area for gate K-12, taking in the scene with the analytical precision of a man who'd built his fortune by seeing patterns others missed. Patience, Elena. We'll be in Barbados by midnight. 24 hours from now, your only medical decision will be whether to order the rum punch or the mojito. To anyone watching from the crowded gate area, they were just another attractive, well-dressed couple. James wore faded jeans and a navy hoodie that had seen better days, carrying a standard leather duffel that looked like it had traveled more miles than most people's cars. Elena, a renowned pediatric surgeon whose hands had guided countless children back to health, wore comfortable linen pants and a soft cashmere blazer, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant bun that somehow looked effortless, despite the 16-hour surgery she'd just completed. They were flying business class on this long-overdue vacation, but they carried their own luggage and waited patiently like everyone else, blending seamlessly into the sea of tired travelers. They were, in a word, unassuming, and in the chaotic hierarchical world of commercial aviation, unassuming was often mistaken for unimportant. At the podium that served as her throne gate, agent Jennifer Walsh was having what she would later describe to unemployment counselors as the worst day of her career. Her shift had started at 7:00 a.m. with a computer system crash that had taken 3 hours to resolve. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, and the 4:15 p.m. flight to Miami that she was supposed to be boarding had been delayed until 5:30 p.m. due to mechanical issues. The flight was overbooked by 12 passengers, which meant 12 potential confrontations with people who thought their problems were her responsibility. Jennifer's bleached blonde hair was pulled into a severe ponytail that seemed designed to emphasize the sharp angles of her face, and her expression had settled into a mask of practiced indifference that kept slipping into active hostility. She was a 12-year veteran of Pacific Airways, and in her mind, that seniority gave her ownership of Gate K-12. This was her kingdom, the podium her throne, and the passengers were her unruly, often idiotic subjects who needed constant management. She lived for the small but potent surge of power that came from enforcing regulations rules she often interpreted through the lens of her own biases and personal frustrations. Already today she'd made an elderly woman cry by refusing to help with a wheelchair request, claiming it wasn't her department. She'd berated a non-English-speaking family for standing in the wrong line, speaking loudly and slowly as if volume could translate her irritation. And she'd just finished a shouting match with a businessman whose carry-on was half an inch too wide, treating the minor infraction like a personal attack on aviation safety. Jennifer picked up the microphone, her voice cutting through the terminal din like a serrated knife drawn across glass. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will now be commencing the pre-boarding process for Pacific Airways Flight 922 to Miami. We will only be pre-boarding our Diamond Medallion members' families with small children and those needing extra assistance. Only those groups. Do not crowd the gate. Have your boarding passes and passports ready. The announcement crackled through speakers that had seen better decades mixing with the ambient noise of rolling luggage, crying babies, and 100 different conversations in a dozen different languages. James and Elena stood up gathering their bags with the practiced efficiency of frequent travelers. They were in Group 1 business class, so they still had a few minutes before their boarding call. James adjusted the strap of his leather duffel, the same bag he'd carried on hundreds of flights across 6 continents. It was regulation compliant in every dimension, soft-sided, and built to compress if needed with reinforced corners and high-quality zippers that had never failed him. Elena shouldered her small purse and grabbed her tablet case, checking her phone one last time for any urgent messages from the hospital. Jennifer watched the pre-boarding line form with predatory focus, her eyes narrowing as a young family struggled with an oversized stroller. "Sir, that stroller has to be gate-checked. You can't bring that monstrosity on board." "What were you thinking?" she snapped, not waiting for an answer, and clearly enjoying the father's flustered attempts to explain that they'd been allowed to bring it on their previous 3 flights. Elena sighed, feeling her hard-earned vacation calm evaporating like morning dew. "She's a menace, James. She's a bully in a uniform," James replied quietly, his gaze analytical as he studied Jennifer's interactions with other passengers. "It's a personality type. Small pond, big fish syndrome. She's probably been doing this so long she's forgotten there's a whole ocean out there. Well, this big fish is about to get an earful if she talks to us like that," Elena muttered, her surgeon's precision extending to her assessment of problematic people. "She won't," James said with the quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of navigating worlds that weren't built for people who looked like him. "We're not her problem. We're business-class passengers with valid tickets. We just need to get on the plane and get to our vacation." He was wrong, and the mistake would cost Jennifer Walsh her career. As the Diamond Medallion members began filing through the boarding gate, Jennifer's attention landed on James and Elena, who were standing patiently near the Group 1 line. Her eyes performed a quick, practiced assessment that had nothing to do with aviation security and everything to do with personal prejudice. She saw a black man in casual clothes carrying what looked to her biased perception like an oversized bag. She didn't see a successful entrepreneur and venture capitalist. She didn't see one of Pacific Airways' largest private investors. She saw in her prejudiced estimation someone who didn't belong in the business class line. Jennifer's focus zeroed in on James's leather duffel like a heat-seeking missile. The bag was soft-sided and perfectly regulation-compliant, meeting every size requirement published in Pacific Airways passenger guidelines. But in Jennifer's eyes, it wasn't just a piece of luggage. It was ammunition. It was an excuse wrapped in what she told herself was legitimate policy enforcement. She finished processing a Diamond member, a well-dressed white businessman, who she'd waved through without even glancing at his oversized roller bag. Then, instead of calling the next boarding group, she raised her voice and pointed a rigid, red-nailed finger directly at James. "Sir, you in the black hoodie with that bag." James looked up mildly surprised. The terminal's ambient noise seemed to dim slightly, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "Me." "Yes, you," Jennifer said, her voice dripping with accusation and authority. She was about to learn she didn't actually possess. "That bag is not going to fit in the overhead compartment. You'll need to check it. Bring it here. Now." The gate area fell silent in the way that public spaces do when something uncomfortable is about to happen. Passengers in line turned to stare, their conversations dying mid-sentence. The act of singling someone out of pointing and commanding had shifted the terminal's energy from ambient chaos to focused tension. Even the family with the stroller stopped their struggles to watch what was unfolding. James, ever the pragmatist and preferring resolution to conflict, walked forward with his bag. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for a solution that would get him and Elena to Barbados without drama. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I believe there might be a misunderstanding. This bag is standard carry-on size. I've flown with it hundreds of times on this exact aircraft type." The reasonable tone and articulate response seemed to infuriate Jennifer further. In her worldview, people like him weren't supposed to be educated or well-spoken. It felt like a challenge to the natural order she'd constructed in her mind, where she held the power and passengers submitted to her authority without question. "I don't care what you've flown with," before she snapped her fingers, flying across her computer keyboard with unnecessary force. "Our policy is our policy. Your bag looks too large, and frankly, I don't have time for arguments. You need to put it in the sizing device." She gestured toward the blue metal cage that served as the carry-on sizing station, the device that frequent travelers called the guillotine because of its ability to destroy vacation plans with mechanical precision. Elena stepped forward, her surgeon's instinct for advocacy kicking in. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we are flying business class. Our tickets include 2 carry-on bags, and that bag," she said, nodding toward James's duffel, "will fit in any overhead compartment on any commercial aircraft." Jennifer finally looked up from her computer, her eyes glinting with the kind of malice that comes from having just enough power to hurt people and not enough wisdom to use it properly. She looked Elena up and down with a dismissive sneer that she'd perfected over years of gatekeeping. "Business class doesn't mean you get to make up your own rules," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Put the bag in the sizer, or I'll have it checked to Miami. Your choice." A ripple of discomfort went through the growing crowd of passengers. A young man named Miguel Santos, a college student heading home to visit family, suddenly lifted his phone and began recording. He'd seen this movie before, and he knew how it usually ended. But something told him this time might be different. James held up a hand to Elena, a silent signal to let him handle the situation. He'd learned long ago that the path of least resistance was often the fastest route to resolution. He picked up his bag and, with an air of profound weariness, walked it to the sizing station. The bag was quality leather, soft-sided, and designed to compress when needed. He gave it a gentle push, and it slid perfectly into the metal frame with room to spare on all sides. He turned back to Jennifer, his expression carefully neutral. "As you can see, it fits." This was the moment. This was the crossroads where Jennifer Walsh could have backed down, muttered a grudging fine, and moved on with her day. She could have salvaged her dignity and kept her job, but she had been publicly proven wrong, and by someone she had already profiled, dismissed, and decided didn't deserve respect. Her authority had been challenged in front of witnesses, and in her mind that simply could not stand. "Take it out," she commanded, her voice taking on a shrill edge that made nearby passengers wince. James, confused but still patient, pulled the bag back out of the sizing frame. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. It clearly fits. It looked like you had to force it in." Jennifer lied, her voice rising in pitch as she doubled down on her fabrication. "You people always try to bend the rules, shoving and forcing things where they don't belong. That bag is oversized and it's not coming on this aircraft." The coded language was unmistakable. "You people!" The words hung in the air like toxic gas, poisoning the atmosphere and making it hard for anyone nearby to breathe normally. Elena stepped forward, her voice no longer gentle. "What did you just say?" James put a protective arm in front of his wife. "Elena, don't." But his own voice had dropped to a dangerously quiet level as he turned back to Jennifer. "I want to hear you repeat that." Jennifer's face flushed red, but whether from anger or the sudden realization that she might have gone too far was unclear. Around them, passengers were pulling out phones and the ambient conversations had stopped entirely. Even the family with the stroller had abandoned their struggle to watch what was becoming an incident. "I said your bag doesn't fit," Jennifer replied, but her voice lacked the certainty it had carried moments earlier. "That's not what you said," Elena interjected, her surgeon's precision extending to her memory. "You said you people always try to bend the rules. I want to know exactly what you meant by you people." And that was when Supervisor David Miller appeared, drawn by the commotion like a shark to blood in the water. David Miller had been watching the confrontation from the neighboring gate, and what he saw confirmed every bias he'd nurtured during his 15 years with Pacific Airways. A black passenger arguing with his agent, a crowd gathering phones being pulled out. In his experience, this could only mean one thing: troublemakers who needed to be managed with authority and, if necessary, removed from the terminal. Miller was 52 years old with thinning gray hair and the kind of soft gut that comes from decades of desk work and airport food. He'd started with Pacific Airways as a baggage handler and worked his way up to supervisor through a combination of longevity, reliability, and an ability to handle what management euphemistically called difficult situations. He had a talent for making problems disappear, usually by making the people causing them disappear first. "Jennifer, what seems to be the issue here?" Miller asked, but his eyes were already fixed on James with the kind of suspicion reserved for people he'd already decided were guilty of something. "Mr. Miller, thank goodness you're here," Jennifer said, relief flooding her voice as backup arrived. "This passenger is being aggressive about his oversized luggage. I've explained our policies multiple times, but he refuses to comply." James hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't moved closer to the podium or made any threatening gestures. He was standing exactly where he'd been when the conversation started, holding a bag that demonstrably fit in the sizing device. But in Jennifer's retelling, he became an aggressor, and Miller accepted that narrative without question. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from my agent." "Miller," said his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I haven't moved," James replied calmly. "I'm standing in the same spot I've been in for the last 10 minutes. Miguel Santos, still recording from his position in the Group 2 line, made sure his phone captured Miller's arrival and the completely false characterization of James's behavior. Around him, other passengers were beginning to murmur, their discomfort growing as they witnessed what was clearly becoming harassment. "Your agent used discriminatory language," Elena said, stepping slightly forward but keeping her voice level and professional. "She referred to us as you people and made false claims about luggage that demonstrably fits your size requirements." Miller's expression didn't change. He'd perfected the art of selective hearing when it came to discrimination complaints. In his experience, passengers who claimed bias were usually just trying to get special treatment or free upgrades. "I didn't hear any inappropriate language," he said dismissively. "I heard an agent explaining policy to a non-compliant passenger." "Non-compliant." Elena's voice carried the sharp edge that every resident and intern in her hospital had learned to fear. "We haven't refused to comply with anything. We've done exactly what was requested, and when the bag fit perfectly in your sizing device, your agent lied about what happened." Sarah Thompson, a regular Pacific Airways passenger standing in the priority boarding line, found herself speaking up despite her usual preference for avoiding confrontation. "I saw the whole thing. The bag fit easily. There was no forcing involved." Miller turned his attention to Sarah with the kind of look that said her input wasn't welcome. "Ma'am, I'll need you to focus on your own boarding process." But Sarah had 2 teenage daughters and a lifetime of experience recognizing bullying when she saw it. "This is my boarding process. I'm waiting to board the same flight, and I'm watching 2 passengers being harassed for no reason." "There's no harassment occurring here," Miller replied, but his voice carried less certainty than it had moments before. The crowd was growing, and more passengers were openly watching the confrontation. Some had phones out, and the last thing Pacific Airways needed was another viral video of passenger mistreatment. Robert Kim, a business traveler who flew Pacific Airways twice a month, stepped forward from his position near the gate. "I've flown this route dozens of times. I've seen Jennifer target minority passengers before. This is a pattern, not an isolated incident. Miller's jaw tightened. Witnesses were bad enough, but witnesses who were regular customers were a problem that could escalate beyond his pay grade. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to the boarding area." "We're all in the boarding area," Robert replied, "and we're all witnessing the same thing." James watched the exchange with growing concern. He'd been in situations like this before, and he knew how they could spiral. The key was to remain calm, document everything, and avoid any action that could be mischaracterized later. But he also knew that sometimes calm wasn't enough. "Mr. Miller James," said his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the supervisor pause. "I'd like to speak with your station manager." "I am the station manager for this gate," Miller lied smoothly. "And I'm telling you that your bag needs to be checked or you won't be boarding this aircraft." Jennifer, emboldened by Miller's support, stepped back to her microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a delay due to non-compliant passengers. Please remain patient while we resolve this issue." The announcement was calculated to turn the other passengers against James and Elena to frame them as the reason for any boarding delays. It was a tactic Jennifer had used before, but she'd never tried it with someone who understood exactly what she was doing and had the power to stop it. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from the hospital. Another surgeon was covering her patients, but there were questions that needed answers. She glanced at the message, then at her husband, and made a decision that would change everything. "James," she said quietly, "make the call." James looked at her for a long moment, understanding passing between them. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this. He'd wanted their vacation to start without drama, without using the power he preferred to keep hidden. But Jennifer and Miller had made their choices, and consequences were about to follow. He pulled out his phone, a simple iPhone that looked no different from thousands of others in the terminal. But the number he dialed connected directly to the Pacific Airways Corporate Operations Center, and the woman who answered knew exactly who he was. "Patricia, it's James. I need immediate action at O'Hare Gate K-12. The voice that came through the speaker was clear, professional, and carried the authority of someone accustomed to handling crises. "Mr. Carter, what's your situation?" Jennifer heard the conversation and tried to intervene. "Sir, you can't make personal phone calls during the boarding process." But James was no longer listening to Jennifer. His attention was entirely focused on the phone call that was about to end her career. "We're dealing with discriminatory language from a gate agent and harassment from a supervisor. Both are claiming authority they don't possess and making false statements about regulation compliance." Patricia Williams, Pacific Airways Chief of Operations, was a 25-year veteran of the airline industry who'd worked her way up from flight attendant to the C-suite. She'd dealt with thousands of passenger complaints, but calls from James Carter were different. James was one of Pacific Airways' largest private investors, holding a 45% stake in the company and serving on the board of directors. More importantly, Patricia had known James for 8 years. She'd worked with him on strategic planning, route optimization, and customer experience improvements. She knew he wasn't someone who called with frivolous complaints or who used his position for personal benefit. If James was calling about discrimination, it was because discrimination was actually happening. "Mr. Carter, I have you on speaker. Can you describe the specific incidents?" James glanced at Miller and Jennifer, both of whom were looking increasingly confused. Neither had realized that the phone call was being broadcast, and neither understood who they were dealing with. "Gate agent Jennifer Walsh singled out my wife and me for bag inspection despite our business class tickets. When our regulation-compliant luggage passed the sizing test, she lied about the results and used the phrase, 'You people always try to bend the rules.' Supervisor David Miller arrived immediately, sided with the agent without investigation, and has been attempting to characterize us as aggressive despite our complete cooperation." Patricia's voice came through the phone with crystalline clarity. "Mr. Carter, I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded for quality assurance. Mr. Miller." Ms. Walsh, you're both being placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Miller's face went white. I'm sorry, who is this? This is Patricia Williams, Chief of Operations for Pacific Airways. Mr. Carter, would you please identify yourself to the staff? James reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. From it, he extracted a corporate ID card and a letter of authorization, both bearing the Pacific Airways logo and his photograph. He held them up for Miller and Jennifer to see. My name is James Carter. I'm a member of the Pacific Airways Board of Directors and hold a 45% ownership stake in this company. Ms. Walsh, Mr. Miller, your employment is terminated immediately. The words fell like anvils into the suddenly silent gate area. Jennifer's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Miller took a step backward, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing panic. You can't just fire us, Jennifer finally managed to say. You don't have that authority. Patricia's voice came through the phone speaker with the finality of a judge's gavel. Mr. Carter has full operational authority as outlined in Pacific Airways Board Resolution 847B. Ms. Walsh, your termination is effective immediately for violation of our anti-discrimination policies and customer service standards. Mr. Miller, your termination is effective immediately for failure to investigate bias complaints and misrepresentation of company policy. Miguel Santos, still recording everything, whispered to his phone. This is really happening. The passenger they were harassing just fired them both. Sarah Thompson found herself clapping slowly at first, then more enthusiastically as other passengers joined in. The applause wasn't for revenge or humiliation. It was for accountability for the rare moment when power was used properly and consequences followed actions immediately. I didn't know who you were, Jennifer said, her voice cracking as the reality of her situation began to sink in. James's response was quiet but devastating. And if I had been someone else, someone without power or connections, would your behavior have been different? Jennifer had no answer because they all knew the truth. Her discrimination had been intentional, calculated, and routine. The only thing unusual about this incident was that she'd finally chosen the wrong target, Mr. Carter. Patricia's voice continued. Pacific Airways security will be at the gate within 15 minutes to escort these former employees from the premises. Is there anything else you need? James looked around the gate area at the passengers who had witnessed the entire incident, at Miguel, still recording, at Sarah and Robert, who had spoken up when silence would have been easier. Patricia, I want a complete audit of hiring and training practices at this facility, and I want to review every discrimination complaint filed against this station in the past 5 years. Already in progress, sir. The audit team is en route. Miller, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of his career, tried one last appeal. Mr. Carter, I was just supporting my staff. I didn't hear any discriminatory language. Elena spoke for the first time since the phone call began, her surgeon's precision extending to her dismantling of Miller's defense. You heard what you chose to hear. You saw 2 black passengers and immediately assumed we were the problem. You never investigated, never questioned, never considered that your agent might be wrong. That's not support. That's enabling discrimination. The truth of her words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Miller had no response because there was no response. His bias had been exposed, his judgment questioned, and his career ended by his own choices. Pacific Airways security arrived exactly 14 minutes later, professional and courteous as they escorted Jennifer and Miller from the terminal. Neither resisted. Jennifer was crying not from remorse, but from the shock of consequences. Miller walked in stunned silence, already calculating unemployment benefits and wondering if any other airline would hire someone fired for discrimination. As they disappeared into the terminal corridors, Patricia's voice came through James's phone one final time. Mr. Carter, your flight will board in 10 minutes. The aircraft has been held for you. James ended the call and looked around at the crowd of passengers who had witnessed the entire incident. Some were still recording, others were talking quietly among themselves, all processing what they'd just seen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the gate area, "I apologize for the delay. Sometimes change happens quickly, but it only happens when good people speak up." He looked directly at Miguel, Sarah, and Robert. "Thank you for not staying silent." The boarding process began 5 minutes later, conducted by a replacement agent who had been rushed from another gate. She was professional, efficient, and treated every passenger with the same courtesy regardless of their appearance or perceived status. James and Elena boarded first, not because they demanded special treatment, but because they were business-class passengers who'd been through enough disruption for one day. As they walked down the jet bridge, Elena squeezed her husband's hand. "Think that was worth missing our spa appointments for?" James smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn since entering the terminal. "Depends." "Do you think Jennifer learned anything?" Elena considered the question as they stepped onto the aircraft. "I think Jennifer learned that actions have consequences. Whether she learned anything deeper than that?" She shrugged. "Some people have to lose everything before they're willing to examine how they got there." The flight attendant greeting passengers at the aircraft door looked up as they approached. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, welcome aboard. We've upgraded you to first class as an apology for the disruption." James shook his head politely. "Thank you, but business class is perfect. We're just ready to start our vacation." As they settled into their seats, Elena pulled out her phone to update the hospital on her delayed departure. James opened his tablet and began drafting an email to Patricia Williams. The incident was over, but the work was just beginning. The aircraft pushed back from the gate 20 minutes later, carrying 247 passengers toward their various destinations. Most would remember the flight for the drama at the gate, the rare moment when discrimination met immediate consequences. But for James and Elena, it was simply the delayed beginning of a well-deserved vacation. Below them, Chicago O'Hare continued its relentless operation, processing thousands of passengers through its corridors. At Gate K-12, a new shift was beginning with new agents, who would soon learn that Pacific Airways had new expectations for how passengers were treated. Change was coming to O'Hare. Some of it would be policy, some training, some structural reorganization. But all of it would stem from a single moment when someone with power chose to use it properly and a crowd of passengers chose to speak instead of staying silent. The transformation began before James and Elena's flight had even reached cruising altitude. Patricia Williams was already on the ground at O'Hare, her corporate jet having departed from Pacific Airways headquarters the moment James's call ended. She arrived at Terminal 3 with a small team of investigators, human resources specialists, and legal advisors, all carrying tablets loaded with personnel files, complaint records, and authorization documents that would reshape the entire O'Hare operation. Patricia was 55 years old, with silver-streaked hair that she wore pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd risen through the ranks of Pacific Airways by combining operational excellence with genuine concern for both employees and passengers. She was known throughout the company as someone who solved problems rather than hiding them, and she had James Carter's complete trust when it came to implementing change. Gate K-12 had been cordoned off as a crime scene of corporate misconduct. The replacement agent who'd finished boarding Flight 922 was documenting everything she'd observed while Patricia's team began interviewing passengers who had witnessed the incident. Miguel Santos's video footage was being analyzed frame by frame, providing irrefutable evidence of what had transpired. Ms. Rodriguez Patricia said, approaching Sarah Thompson, who was waiting for her connecting flight, "I'm Patricia Williams with Pacific Airways Corporate. Would you be willing to provide a statement about what you observed today?" Sarah looked up from her phone where she'd been telling her daughters about the incident via text message. "I've been flying Pacific Airways for 8 years. I've seen Jennifer Walsh target minority passengers before, but never this blatantly. She was looking for a fight from the moment she saw them." Patricia made notes on her tablet as Sarah continued. The bag clearly fit in the sizer. There was no ambiguity about it. When she claimed he'd forced it in, she was lying and everyone could see it. But it was the "you people" comment that crossed the line. There was no mistaking what she meant. Robert Kim, waiting nearby for his own connection, overheard the conversation and approached. "I need to tell you something," he said to Patricia. "This wasn't Jennifer's first incident. I fly this route twice a month for business, and I've seen her target passengers before. Hispanic families, Asian travelers, Black passengers. She has a pattern." Patricia's expression hardened. "Can you be specific?" 3 months ago, I watched her force an elderly Korean woman to gate-check a purse that was smaller than what she'd allowed white passengers to carry on. 6 months ago, she made a Hispanic family prove their children were under 2 for lap seating, demanding birth certificates she never asked white families to provide. I reported both incidents through your customer service system. Do you have your complaint numbers?" Robert pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails. "Here. Complaint 4472B and Complaint 5891C. Both were closed as unverified after what your system called internal review." Patricia made more notes, her jaw tightening as she realized the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about Jennifer Walsh or David Miller. This was about an entire structure that had enabled, protected, and covered up discrimination for years. Miguel Santos approached hesitantly, still processing what he'd witnessed and recorded. "Excuse me, are you investigating what happened with Mr. Carter?" "I am," Patricia replied. "Miguel, right, I understand you recorded the incident." "Most of it," Miguel confirmed. "I started recording when Jennifer first singled them out, and I got everything from the bag test through the terminations. Do you want me to send you the file?" "Absolutely. But first, tell me what you saw from your perspective." Miguel thought carefully before speaking. "I've flown a lot with my family, and we've dealt with agents like Jennifer before. The difference is, Mr. Carter had power. But what impressed me wasn't that he fired them. It was that he stayed calm the whole time. He could have lost his temper, could have pulled rank early, but he let it play out until they showed everyone exactly who they were." Patricia nodded, understanding the deeper implications of Miguel's observation. "You're saying he documented their behavior before revealing his authority?" "Exactly. If he'd shown his board member ID right away, they would have acted differently and no one would have seen their true character. By letting them think he was just another passenger, he proved what they really thought about people who look like him." While Patricia's team continued gathering statements, another investigation was already underway in Pacific Airways corporate offices. The moment James's call had ended, Patricia had authorized a comprehensive audit of all discrimination complaints filed against O'Hare personnel in the past 5 years. What they discovered was a carefully constructed wall of institutional protection that had shielded problematic employees from accountability. Jennifer Walsh had been the subject of 47 discrimination complaints over her 12-year career. 47. The complaints came from passengers of different races, ethnicities, and nationalities, all describing similar patterns of targeting false policy enforcement and degrading treatment. Every single complaint had been closed as unverified or unsubstantiated after what the files called internal investigation. David Miller had personally reviewed and closed 31 of those complaints. His supervisor notes, now being read by corporate investigators, revealed a troubling pattern of dismissing bias claims without serious investigation. Miller's standard response was to interview the accused employee, accept their version of events, and close the case. He never interviewed witnesses, never reviewed security footage, never considered that multiple complaints about the same person might indicate a real problem. But Jennifer wasn't working alone. The audit revealed a network of enabling behavior that extended throughout the O'Hare station. Other gate agents had learned to stay silent when Jennifer targeted passengers, knowing that speaking up would make them targets for Miller's retaliation. Supervisors had learned that certain types of complaints would disappear if they were filed correctly, using language that emphasized passenger non-compliance rather than employee misconduct. Patricia's phone rang as she finished interviewing the last witness from Gate K-12. The caller ID showed James Carter's number. "Mr. Carter, how was your flight?" "Delayed but peaceful." James replied from his hotel room in Barbados, where he was sitting on the balcony with Elena watching the sunset over the Caribbean. "I wanted to check on the investigation." "It's worse than we thought, James. Jennifer had 47 discrimination complaints that were buried by Miller and his chain of command. We're looking at institutional enabling that goes back years." Elena, listening on speaker, shook her head in disgust. 47 complaints, and she was still employed. What does it take to get fired from that place? Apparently it takes targeting someone with board-level authority. Patricia replied grimly. "I've suspended 84 O'Hare employees pending complete review. This isn't just about individual bad actors. This is about a culture that protected them." James leaned forward, his business instincts engaging. "What's your recommendation for corrective action?" "Complete structural overhaul. New management, new training protocols, new complaint resolution procedures. And I want to implement something I'm calling the Carter Protocol." The Carter Protocol. Patricia had been developing the idea during her flight to Chicago. Mandatory bias training for every customer-facing employee, new hiring practices that screen for discriminatory attitudes, and most importantly, an independent review board for all discrimination complaints. No more internal investigations by supervisors who have relationships with the accused. Elena sipped her rum punch and looked out at the ocean. What about Jennifer and Miller? What happens to them now? Terminated with cause, no severance, no references. They're also being reported to the Department of Transportation for civil rights violations, and I suspect there will be criminal charges for Miller related to falsifying federal discrimination reports. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes as Patricia outlined the scope of the coming changes. When it ended, James set down his phone and took Elena's hand. "Second thoughts about how we handled it?" she asked. James considered the question while watching a pelican dive for fish in the crystal-clear water below their balcony. No second thoughts about Jennifer and Miller. They made their choices, and they earned their consequences. But I do wonder about the other employees who got caught up in the suspension. The enablers. Some of them probably. But some might just be people who were afraid to speak up, who were trapped in a toxic culture they didn't create. Patricia will sort it out. She's good at separating the willing participants from the unwilling victims. Elena squeezed his hand. "You know what I like most about what you did today? What you didn't just fire 2 racists. You created a structure to prevent the next ones from succeeding. That's not revenge. That's progress." Back in Chicago, Patricia was implementing the first phase of what would become the most comprehensive overhaul in Pacific Airways history. The 84 suspended employees were being individually reviewed, their personnel files examined, their complaint histories analyzed. Some would be terminated, some would be retrained, and some would be cleared to return to work after completing enhanced bias training. But the changes went beyond personnel decisions. Patricia was redesigning the entire customer service structure at O'Hare, implementing new oversight mechanisms, creating anonymous reporting structures, and establishing partnership with civil rights organizations to provide external monitoring of airline practices. The work would take months to complete, but the foundation was being laid that very night. As Patricia worked through personnel files in a conference room overlooking the runways, she received an email from James that made her smile despite the exhaustion of the day. Patricia. The message read, "Elena and I have been talking about long-term improvements beyond what happened today. I want to fund a foundation focused on passenger rights and airline accountability. Let's discuss when I get back from vacation. Also tell your team they're doing important work. Change is hard, but it's necessary. The attached document was a preliminary proposal for the Travelers' Dignity Fund, a $50 million foundation that would provide legal aid to passengers who experienced discrimination, fund research into bias in transportation, and advocate for policy changes at the federal level. The fund would be independent of Pacific Airways, able to investigate and challenge any airline that failed to protect passenger rights. Patricia forwarded the proposal to her legal team with a note, "Review and prepare implementation timeline. This is priority 1. As she worked through the night analyzing complaint patterns and designing new training protocols, Patricia thought about the passengers who had spoken up at Gate K-12. Miguel Santos, Sarah Thompson, Robert Kim, and others who could have stayed silent but chose to bear witness instead. Their voices had been crucial in documenting what happened and building the case for broad-based reform. That was perhaps the most important lesson from the day's events. Individual discrimination required individual accountability, but institutional discrimination required institutional change. Jennifer Walsh and David Miller were symptoms of a larger disease, and treating only the symptoms would have left the disease free to spread. The Carter Protocol, as it was already being called in internal corporate communications, would address both levels of the problem. Individual employees would be held accountable for their actions through improved training, better oversight, and swift consequences for misconduct. But more importantly, the institutional structures that had protected discriminatory behavior would be dismantled and replaced with ones designed to prevent it. By dawn, Patricia had reviewed every suspended employee's file and made preliminary decisions about their futures. 12 would be terminated immediately for documented patterns of discriminatory behavior. 41 would be required to complete intensive retraining before returning to work. 27 would be cleared for immediate return after completing standard bias awareness training. And 4, including the replacement agent who had finished boarding Flight 922, would be promoted to supervisory positions to help implement the new culture. The numbers told a story that was both encouraging and disturbing. More than half the suspended employees could be rehabilitated with proper training and oversight, but nearly 20% had such extensive records of problematic behavior that termination was the only option. The fact that so many bad actors had been allowed to remain in customer-facing positions for so long represented a massive failure of leadership that went well beyond David Miller's direct responsibilities. As Patricia prepared to brief Pacific Airways Board of Directors on the investigation's findings, she reflected on the strange chain of events that had led to this moment. If James and Elena had been flying on a different airline, Jennifer's discrimination would have gone unchallenged and unpunished. If they'd been flying under fake names, or if James had revealed his identity immediately, the full extent of the behavior wouldn't have been documented. Instead, a perfect storm of circumstances had exposed a network of institutional racism that had been operating in plain sight for years. Jennifer's arrogance had finally targeted someone with the power and willingness to hold her accountable. Miller's reflexive enabling had been documented by multiple witnesses, and a group of passengers had chosen to speak up instead of looking away. The board meeting was scheduled for 9:00 a.m., just 4 hours away. Patricia would present her findings, outline the proposed changes, and request authorization for the largest personnel and policy overhaul in company history. She expected full approval. James Carter's 45% ownership stake meant his support was essentially decisive, and the other board members understood the legal and reputational risks of maintaining the status quo. But more than authorization, Patricia needed buy-in from the entire Pacific Airways organization. Changing policies was easy. Changing culture required sustained commitment from leadership, middle management, and frontline employees. It required acknowledging that the company had failed its passengers and its employees by tolerating discrimination for so long. As she prepared her presentation slides, Patricia thought about Jennifer Walsh, now facing unemployment and potential criminal charges. There was no joy in anyone's downfall, but there was satisfaction in knowing that her behavior would finally have consequences. More importantly, there was hope that the changes being implemented would prevent future Jennifer Walshes from succeeding. The sun was rising over O'Hare as Patricia finished her work. In a few hours, the terminal would fill with thousands of passengers most unaware that they were witnessing the first day of a new era in airline customer service. The changes wouldn't be immediately visible, but they would be real and lasting. Patricia packed up her files and prepared to leave for corporate headquarters. She had a board presentation to deliver a new culture to build and a promise to keep to James Carter, Elena Rodriguez, and every passenger who deserved to travel with dignity. The revolution had begun with 2 words, you people. It would continue with 2 different words, never again. 6 months after Jennifer Walsh's termination, Chicago O'Hare. Terminal 3 looked remarkably similar to any casual observer, but everything fundamental about how it operated had changed. The gates still served the same destinations, the planes still arrived and departed on schedule, and passengers still hurried through the corridors with their rolling luggage and caffeine dependencies. But beneath the surface familiarity, a complete cultural transformation had taken place. Patricia Williams stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Gate K-12, watching the morning boarding process for Pacific Airways Flight 922 to Miami. The same route, the same gate, the same destination that had witnessed Jennifer's meltdown 6 months earlier. But the agent managing the boarding process was Sofia Mendez, a former customer service representative who'd been promoted after demonstrating exactly the kind of patient professional behavior that had been so notably absent before. Sofia was helping an elderly passenger with mobility issues navigate the boarding process, coordinating with the gate bridge crew to ensure wheelchair accessibility and personally verifying that the passenger's medical equipment was properly tagged for priority handling. It was the kind of service that should have been standard, but had become revolutionary through its absence from the old regime. Miss Williams. The voice belonged to Marcus Thompson, Patricia's newly appointed Director of Customer Experience Transformation. Marcus was a 40-year veteran of the hospitality industry who'd been recruited specifically to oversee the cultural changes at O'Hare. He was African American, a deliberate choice by Patricia to ensure that diversity wasn't just a policy goal but a visible leadership reality. "The 9 o'clock status meeting is ready," Marcus continued. "We have some interesting data from the first quarter that I think you'll want to see." Patricia nodded, taking one last look at the smooth professional boarding process below. 6 months ago, that same scene might have included arbitrary luggage challenges, discriminatory language, and passengers left feeling humiliated. Today it looked like what air travel was supposed to be: efficient, respectful, and dignified for everyone involved. The conference room Patricia entered was filled with faces that would have been unthinkable in the old O'Hare management structure. The leadership team now included Marcus Thompson, Sofia Mendez, promoted to Senior Customer Service Specialist, Dr. Angela Washington, the new Director of Bias Prevention and Training, and Captain Sarah Elena Rodriguez, a veteran pilot who'd been assigned to help design new crew coordination protocols. Dr. Washington was a clinical psychologist who specialized in implicit bias training. She'd been recruited from Northwestern University specifically to design what was now being called the Carter Protocol, the comprehensive training program that every Pacific Airways employee was required to complete before working in customer-facing positions. "Let's start with the numbers," Patricia said, settling into her chair at the head of the table. "How are we doing on implementation?" Marcus pulled up a presentation on the wall-mounted screen. "All 347 customer service agents at O'Hare have completed Phase 1 of the Carter Protocol training. 87% passed on their first attempt. 13% required remedial training before certification. Of the original 84 suspended employees, 31 were cleared for return to duty, 12 were terminated, and 41 are still completing enhanced retraining programs." Dr. Washington leaned forward. "The remedial training cases are particularly interesting. Most of them weren't malicious actors like Jennifer Walsh. They were employees who'd been working in a toxic environment for so long that they'd normalized discriminatory behavior without necessarily being discriminatory themselves." "Can you elaborate on that?" Patricia asked. Take Maria Santos, for example. She'd been working at gate services for 8 years and had never received a discrimination complaint. But during her Carter Protocol assessment, we discovered that she'd been following informal protocols passed down from Jennifer and other senior agents. Things like watch for oversized luggage from certain passengers, or be extra careful with identification verification for people who don't look like frequent flyers. She thought she was being thorough, but she was actually implementing profiling practices. Sophia Mendez, who'd worked alongside Maria for 3 years, nodded in recognition. I remember those unofficial rules. New agents learned them from senior staff during training. Nobody questioned them because they seemed like experience-based guidance. And that's exactly how institutional bias perpetuates itself. Dr. Washington continued. Individual employees make individual decisions that seem reasonable in isolation, but create patterns of discriminatory treatment when aggregated across an entire workforce. Patricia made notes as the discussion continued. The Carter Protocol had been designed to address exactly this issue, breaking down both explicit and implicit bias through a combination of psychological assessment, scenario-based training, and ongoing monitoring. But the program went beyond traditional diversity training by focusing specifically on the airline industry's unique power dynamics and stress factors. What about complaint resolution? Patricia asked. Are we seeing changes in how discrimination issues are being handled? Marcus switched to a new slide showing complaint statistics. This is remarkable. In the 6 months before the Carter implementation, we received 43 discrimination complaints about O'Hare operations. Only 3 were upheld after internal investigation. In the 6 months since implementation, we've received 17 complaints and 12 have been upheld with corrective action taken. That's a 60% reduction in complaints, but a 400% increase in substantiated cases, Patricia observed. What does that tell us? Dr. Washington smiled. It tells us that the training is working on 2 levels. First, better trained employees are engaging in fewer discriminatory behaviors, hence fewer complaints. But second, when complaints are filed, they're being investigated properly instead of being buried by supervisors who want to protect their staff. The new complaint resolution process was one of Patricia's proudest innovations. Instead of internal investigations conducted by supervisors with personal relationships to the accused employees, all discrimination complaints were now reviewed by an independent panel that included civil rights advocates, customer service experts, and senior management from outside the accused employee's direct chain of command. Captain Rodriguez, who'd been quietly reviewing flight crew reports during the discussion, looked up with a concerned expression. We're seeing similar patterns in the cockpit and cabin crew environment, but the solutions are more complex because of federal aviation regulations and union contracts. Patricia had been expecting this issue. The Federal Aviation Administration had strict protocols for pilot and flight attendant training that couldn't be modified without extensive regulatory approval, but that didn't mean improvements were impossible. Tell me more about what you're seeing, Patricia said. Flight crews are reporting much better ground interactions since the Carter Protocol implementation. Gate agents are communicating more professionally. Boarding processes are smoother, and there are fewer passenger complaints about ground staff reaching the cabin crew. But we're still dealing with legacy bias issues among some pilots and flight attendants who weren't part of the O'Hare overhaul. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. We've talked about expanding the Carter Protocol company-wide, but that's a massive undertaking. We have 47,000 customer-facing employees across 600 airports, and a 45% shareholder who's made it clear that he expects company-wide implementation, Patricia replied. James Carter didn't create this protocol to fix one airport. He created it to fix one airline and then to serve as a model for the entire industry. The conversation was interrupted by Patricia's assistant, who entered the conference room with an urgent expression. Ms. Williams, I have James Carter on line 1. He says it's about the foundation announcement. Patricia excused herself and took the call in her private office. James was calling from his corporate headquarters in San Francisco, where he was preparing for the public launch of the Traveler's Dignity Fund. Patricia, we're going live with the announcement this afternoon. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox Business all want interviews about the foundation and the changes at Pacific Airways. Are you ready for the spotlight? As ready as anyone can be for national media attention about discrimination in aviation, Patricia replied. How much detail do you want to share about the O'Hare situation? All of it. Jennifer's termination, Miller's criminal charges, the 84 suspensions, the Carter Protocol, everything. The point isn't to embarrass Pacific Airways. The point is to show that change is possible when leadership takes discrimination seriously. Patricia understood James's strategy. By being completely transparent about Pacific Airways' failures and solutions, he was challenging other airlines to match their commitment to reform. Companies that continued tolerating discriminatory behavior would look negligent by comparison. I've prepared a comprehensive briefing packet for the media interviews, Patricia said. 6 months of data complaint resolution statistics, employee feedback, and passenger satisfaction surveys. The numbers tell a compelling story. Good. But remember, the human element is what people will remember. Talk about Sophia Mendez's promotion, Marcus Thompson's leadership, Dr. Washington's training innovations. Show them that this isn't just policy change, it's cultural transformation. After ending the call, Patricia returned to the conference room where the discussion had moved on to employee feedback about the new protocols. The picture being painted was largely positive, but not without challenges. Some veteran employees are struggling with the changes, Sophia admitted, not because they disagree with treating passengers fairly, but because the old informal hierarchy gave them status and power they're reluctant to give up. Dr. Washington nodded. That's expected. Any organizational change threatens existing power structures. The key is providing alternative paths to recognition and advancement that reward positive behavior instead of punishing bias. Give me an example, Patricia said. Take Robert Martinez. He'd been a gate agent for 15 years and had developed a reputation as someone who could handle difficult passengers, which usually meant intimidating people into compliance. Under the old approach, supervisors valued that ability. Under the Carter Protocol, it's a liability. How did you address it? We retrained him to use de-escalation techniques instead of intimidation tactics. He was skeptical at first, but after completing the program, his passenger satisfaction scores improved dramatically. Now he's being considered for promotion to senior agent because he's genuinely good at helping people, not just good at shutting them down. Marcus pulled up another slide showing employee retention statistics. We were worried about losing experienced staff during the transition, but retention has actually improved. Turns out a lot of good employees were frustrated by the toxic culture and are relieved to work in a more professional environment. Patricia found that encouraging but not surprising. Discriminatory workplace cultures poisoned the environment for everyone, not just the targets of discrimination. Employees who wanted to treat customers fairly but were pressured to follow biased practices often experienced stress and job dissatisfaction that led to turnover. The meeting was interrupted again, this time by Sophia's radio crackling with a gate announcement. Priority boarding for Pacific Airways Flight 415 to Atlanta. We're welcoming our Platinum members, passengers with young children, and anyone needing additional assistance. Through the conference room's glass walls, they could see Sophia managing the boarding process with the kind of patient professionalism that had become the new standard. A family with twin toddlers was struggling with strollers and car seats, and instead of expressing irritation, Sophia was coordinating with ground crew to provide extra assistance. That would have been a Jennifer Walsh explosion 6 months ago, Marcus observed. And that's exactly why the Carter Protocol works, Dr. Washington added. It doesn't just teach people not to be discriminatory. It teaches them to be actively helpful, to see passenger challenges as problems to solve instead of disruptions to manage. Patricia's phone buzzed with a text message from James' CNN interview moved to 3:00 p.m. Eastern. They want to focus on the foundation launch, but will definitely ask about O'Hare. Be ready for tough questions about why these problems existed for so long. She shared the update with her team. We're going national this afternoon. Dr. Washington, I want you on standby in case they want to interview the training specialist. Marcus, please prepare a summary of our O'Hare transformation statistics. Sophia, you might get asked to speak from an employee perspective. Are you nervous? Sophia asked. Patricia considered the question. 6 months ago, she would have been terrified to discuss Pacific Airways discrimination problems on national television. But now, with concrete evidence of successful reform and a clear plan for continued improvement, she felt confident about telling the story. Not nervous, she replied. Ready. We have nothing to hide and everything to be proud of. We identified a problem, took responsibility for it, and implemented comprehensive solutions. That's not embarrassing. That's leadership. The afternoon media interviews went better than Patricia had hoped. The CNN reporter was clearly expecting defensive corporate spin, but instead found a company executive eager to discuss both failures and solutions in detail. When asked why Pacific Airways discrimination problems had persisted for so long, Patricia gave an answer that made headlines across the aviation industry. We failed because we treated discrimination as a customer service problem instead of a civil rights violation. We tried to manage complaints instead of preventing them. We protected employees who should have been terminated and ignored passengers who deserved justice. The O'Hare situation forced us to confront the difference between intentions and results. Our intentions were good, but our results were discriminatory, and results are what matter to the people we serve. The interview footage was shared thousands of times across social media, with many commenters expressing surprise at the candor and comprehensiveness of Pacific Airways' response. Other airlines' customer service practices suddenly came under increased scrutiny, with passengers sharing their own experiences of discriminatory treatment and demanding similar accountability. Within hours of the broadcast, Patricia began receiving calls from competitors asking about the Carter Protocol's implementation details. Some were genuine requests for information about bias prevention training. Others were clearly attempts to gather intelligence about Pacific Airways' new competitive advantages in customer satisfaction. The Travelers' Dignity Fund announcement made simultaneously with the media interviews generated even more attention. A $50 million foundation dedicated to providing legal assistance to discriminated passengers was unprecedented in the transportation industry. The fund's first major case, representing a Hispanic family who'd been removed from a Delta flight after complaining about discriminatory seating assignments, was already making headlines. But perhaps the most significant response came from Washington, D.C., where Senator Elizabeth Warren's office announced plans for congressional hearings on discrimination in commercial aviation. The hearings would examine industry-wide practices and consider federal legislation requiring standardized bias training for all airline employees. Back at O'Hare, the evening shift was beginning as Patricia concluded her final interview of the day. She walked through Terminal 3, observing the ordinary interactions between Pacific Airways staff and passengers. A gate agent was patiently explaining flight delay information to frustrated passengers. A customer service representative was helping an elderly woman navigate the airport's wheelchair assistance program. A supervisor was mediating a dispute between passengers without resorting to threats or intimidation. None of these interactions would make the news, but collectively they represented the transformation Patricia and her team had been working to achieve. Respectful, professional customer service wasn't revolutionary, but in an industry that had normalized discrimination for decades, it felt like a quiet revolution. Patricia's phone rang as she reached her office. Elena Rodriguez was calling from her hospital where she was between surgeries. "Dr. Rodriguez, how can I help you? I just wanted to thank you for the work you're doing. I saw the CNN interview, and I wanted you to know that what happened to James and me 6 months ago has turned into something much bigger and more important than we ever imagined." Patricia sat down at her desk, looking out at the terminal where hundreds of passengers were moving through their travel experiences with dignity intact. "We had a choice after that incident. We could have quietly fired Jennifer and Miller and hoped the problem would disappear, or we could have used it as an opportunity to examine everything we were doing wrong. James pushed us to choose the harder path, and I think we're all better for it." Any regrets about how public this has become? Patricia considered the question. The media attention had been intense, the congressional scrutiny was going to be challenging, and competitor airlines were clearly hoping Pacific Airways would stumble. But the fundamental question wasn't about corporate reputation or competitive advantage. It was about whether people like James and Elena would be treated with dignity the next time they traveled. "No regrets," Patricia said. "Change that happens in private can be reversed in private. Change that happens in public becomes permanent because it creates accountability beyond just internal leadership." After ending the call, Patricia remained in her office working through the operational details that would make the Carter Protocol's nationwide expansion possible. Training materials needed to be developed for different airport environments. Oversight mechanisms needed to be established for remote locations, and performance metrics needed to be created to measure success across diverse operational contexts. The work would take years to complete fully, but the foundation had been laid at O'Hare. More importantly, the principle had been established that discrimination would have immediate, serious consequences, and that passengers' dignity was not negotiable regardless of their appearance, background, or ability to fight back. As Terminal 3 gradually emptied for the night, Patricia reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. Jennifer Walsh's moment of arrogance had exposed institutional failures that might have continued indefinitely otherwise. Miller's reflexive enabling had revealed the depth of cultural problems that required cultural solutions. But most importantly, James Carter's response had demonstrated that power could be used constructively, that accountability was possible, and that change could happen quickly when leadership was genuinely committed to justice. The revolution that began with "you people" was becoming a transformation that would echo throughout the aviation industry for years to come. Not because punishment had been swift, but because prevention had become institutional, and dignity had become non-negotiable. 3 years after Jennifer Walsh's termination, James and Elena Carter returned to Chicago O'Hare for the first time since their interrupted vacation. They weren't traveling for leisure this time. James was attending the National Aviation Ethics Conference, where Patricia Williams would be receiving the Industry Leadership Award for her work implementing the Carter Protocol across all Pacific Airways operations. The familiar walk through Terminal 3 felt like visiting a foreign country that happened to speak the same language. The physical infrastructure remained largely unchanged. Same gates, same shops, same endless corridors filled with rolling luggage and hurried travelers. But the atmosphere was fundamentally different, charged with a professionalism and courtesy that made their original experience feel like a distant nightmare. Elena noticed it first as they approached the Pacific Airways customer service desk. "Look at that," she said, nudging James toward a scene that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. A Pacific Airways agent was patiently helping an elderly Middle Eastern man navigate a complex international connection while his family gathered around with multiple pieces of luggage and several young children. The agent wasn't just processing paperwork. She was actively problem-solving, making phone calls to coordinate with other airlines and ensuring the family understood each step of their journey. That's what customer service looks like when people are trained to help instead of gatekeep, James replied, remembering his own research into customer satisfaction metrics that had improved across every measurable category since the Carter Protocol implementation. As they continued toward Gate K-12, they passed a wall display that hadn't existed during their previous visit. Pacific Airways' commitment to dignity was emblazoned across the top, followed by specific statistics about complaint resolution, employee training, and passenger satisfaction improvements. The numbers told a story of organizational transformation that extended far beyond individual attitude changes. Customer complaints related to discriminatory treatment had dropped by 78% across all Pacific Airways operations. Employee satisfaction surveys showed marked improvement in workplace culture and professional pride. Most tellingly, the airline's overall customer satisfaction rankings had risen from industry average to industry-leading, driven largely by what passengers described as respectful professional service, Gate K-12 looked exactly the same as it had 3 years earlier, but the energy surrounding it was completely different. The current gate agent was David Kim, a 10-year Pacific Airways veteran who'd been promoted to senior customer service specialist after completing advanced Carter protocol training. James and Elena watched as David managed a typically complex boarding situation, an overbooked flight with passenger volunteers needed for later departures, with patience and transparency that made potentially angry passengers into cooperative partners. Mr. and Mrs. Carter. The voice belonged to Sophia Mendez, whom Patricia had introduced as one of the success stories of the O'Hare transformation. Sophia had been promoted twice since the incidents with Jennifer Walsh now serving as Terminal Customer Experience Manager overseeing all Pacific Airways operations at O'Hare. "Ms. Mendez, it's good to see you again," Elena replied, recognizing Sophia from the media coverage of the Carter Protocol implementation. "How are things different now compared to 3 years ago?" Sophia smiled, gesturing toward the bustling gate area where passengers were boarding efficiently and courteously. Night and day difference. The old culture rewarded agents for being tough on passengers for showing who was in charge. The new culture rewards us for problem solving, for making travel easier instead of harder. It's actually more satisfying work now. James looked around the gate area, noting details that spoke to deeper changes. Signage was clearer and more multilingual. Staff wore more diverse name tags reflecting the airport's international passenger base. Most importantly, the interactions he observed between employees and passengers consistently demonstrated respect, regardless of passenger appearance or perceived status. Any resistance from longtime employees who preferred the old way, Elena asked. Some, Sophia admitted. A few people left rather than complete the new training requirements. But most adapted quickly once they realized that treating passengers well made their jobs easier, not harder. Happy passengers are cooperative passengers. The conversation was interrupted by David Kim's voice over the gate announcement approach. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin boarding for Flight 922 to Miami. We'll start with passengers needing extra assistance, families with young children, and our premium cabin guests. Thank you for your patience and welcome aboard Pacific Airways." The announcement was routine, but James noticed how David made eye contact with passengers as he spoke, how his tone conveyed helpfulness rather than authority, and how he immediately moved from behind the podium to assist passengers with questions, rather than maintaining physical barriers between himself and the travelers. "That's the real change," Sophia observed, following James's gaze. "It's not just different words or different policies. It's a different understanding of what our job actually is. We're here to help people travel, not to control them or test them or prove our power over them." As boarding proceeded smoothly and professionally, Elena reflected on the broader implications of what they were witnessing. "Do you think this would have happened without the media attention and congressional pressure?" Sophia considered the question carefully. The individual firings might have happened. Ms. Walsh and Mr. Miller were clearly problematic employees. But the comprehensive changes, the new training, the cultural transformation that required sustained commitment from leadership, and I think the public attention made it impossible for leadership to treat this as a temporary crisis, rather than a permanent priority. James nodded, understanding Sophia's analysis. Accountability works differently when it's public. Private accountability can be negotiated, modified, or forgotten. Public accountability becomes part of institutional memory. They were joined by Marcus Thompson, who'd been observing the boarding process from the operations center and had come to meet James personally. Marcus had become something of an industry celebrity, speaking at conferences about customer service transformation and consulting with other airlines attempting their own cultural changes. "Mr. Carter, it's an honor to meet you," Marcus said, extending his hand. "Your foundation's work has been revolutionary. The Tampa case alone has changed how the entire industry thinks about passenger rights." The Tampa case had been the Travelers' Dignity Fund's first major victory, a successful lawsuit against a major airline that had systematically targeted Hispanic passengers for additional security screening. The $5 million settlement had included not just financial compensation but mandatory bias training for all employees and ongoing monitoring by civil rights organizations. The foundation is just providing resources that should have been available all along, James replied. Legal aid for discrimination victims research into bias prevention policy, advocacy at the federal level. The real credit belongs to people like you and Ms. Williams, who do the daily work of changing organizational culture. Marcus gestured toward the gate area where boarding was concluding without incident stress or conflict. The daily work is actually easier now than it was before. When everyone understands the expectations and has the tools to meet them, there's less drama and more satisfaction for both employees and passengers. Elena checked her phone, noting that their own departure time was approaching. What's the biggest challenge going forward? Maintaining momentum as this becomes routine instead of revolutionary. Exactly that, Marcus replied. The danger is complacency, thinking that because we've solved the obvious problems, we can stop paying attention to the subtle ones. Bias is persistent, and it finds new ways to express itself if you're not actively preventing it. Sophia nodded in agreement. We do monthly bias audits now, looking at complaint patterns, satisfaction surveys, and employee feedback. Not because we expect to find major problems, but because small problems can become major ones if they're not addressed early. As they prepared to leave for their own gate, James and Elena were approached by a young man they didn't recognize. Miguel Santos, now working as a digital media specialist for a civil rights organization, had been covering the Aviation Ethics Conference and recognized them from their previous media appearances. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I'm Miguel Santos. I was at this gate 3 years ago when everything happened with Jennifer Walsh. I recorded the incident. Elena remembered the young man who'd been brave enough to document everything with his phone. Miguel, thank you for speaking up that day. Your video was crucial evidence for the investigation. I actually want to thank you, Miguel replied. What happened here inspired me to change my major from business to social justice advocacy. I'm working with passenger rights organizations now, and a lot of what we do builds on the foundation you created. The conversation continued for several minutes as Miguel described the broader impact of the O'Hare incident on civil rights activism and passenger advocacy. Other airlines had adopted modified versions of the Carter Protocol. Congress had passed stronger anti-discrimination enforcement mechanisms, and passengers were more aware of their rights and more willing to report misconduct. The biggest change isn't in policies, Miguel explained. It's in expectations. Passengers used to accept discriminatory treatment as normal airline behavior. Now they recognize it as unacceptable, and they have resources to fight back. As James and Elena finally walked away from Gate K-12 heading toward their own departure gate, they passed another familiar face. Jennifer Walsh was working at a coffee shop in Terminal 3 wearing a hairnet and serving overpriced airport beverages to travelers who didn't recognize her as the former gate agent whose termination had triggered industry-wide reforms. Elena noticed James's attention and followed his gaze. Any second thoughts about how her story ended? James watched Jennifer mechanically process orders, her movements, efficient but joyless. I feel sorry for her, but I don't regret the consequences she faced. She made choices that hurt people, and choices have consequences. The question isn't whether she deserved what happened to her. The question is whether other people deserve to be protected from what she was doing. Do you think she learned anything? I hope so. But whether she did or not, the important learning happened organizationally. Individual change is personal, but structural change is institutional, and structural change protects people regardless of whether individuals change their hearts. Their own flight boarded without incident, of course. The gate agent was professional and courteous. The process was efficient and respectful, and James found himself noting how normal good customer service felt when it was universal rather than exceptional. As their aircraft pushed back from the gate, Elena looked out the window at Terminal 3, where thousands of passengers were moving through their travel experiences with dignity intact. Do you think this will last? When the media attention fades and new crises emerge, will airlines maintain these standards? James considered the question as Chicago fell away beneath them. The structural changes will last because they're embedded in training policy and oversight mechanisms. The cultural changes will last as long as leadership prioritizes them. But the most important change is in passenger expectations. People now know what good service looks like, and they won't accept discrimination as normal anymore. The flight attendant approached with beverage service, greeting them by name with genuine warmth. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, welcome aboard. Can I get you anything to drink?" It was a small interaction routine and unremarkable, but it represented something profound, a moment when customer service was about service, not control, and when passengers were treated as valued customers rather than potential problems to be managed. 3 years after Jennifer Walsh had said, "You people always try to bend the rules," those words had become the catalyst for the most comprehensive anti-discrimination effort in commercial aviation history. Not because punishment had been swift, but because prevention had become institutional and dignity had become non-negotiable. The aircraft reached cruising altitude as Elena and James settled in for their flight. Below them at airports across the country, passengers were being served by employees trained in the Carter Protocol, protected by the Traveler's Dignity Fund, and covered by federal legislation that made discrimination not just morally wrong, but legally costly. Change had come to commercial aviation not through voluntary goodwill, but through the application of power in service of justice. Sometimes the strongest response to you people was to show them exactly who we are and to build a world where everyone travels with the dignity they deserve. 5 years after that Tuesday afternoon at Gate K-12, the story had become part of aviation industry legend. Business schools taught case studies about the O'Hare transformation. Civil rights organizations used the Traveler's Dignity Fund as a model for corporate accountability partnerships. And millions of passengers traveled with greater dignity because 2 people refused to accept discrimination as normal. James Carter never sought the spotlight that followed him after that day, but he used it strategically. The foundation had grown to protect over 15,000 passengers from discriminatory treatment, settling cases against 12 different airlines and creating precedents that made bias costly for corporations to ignore. The Carter Protocol had been adopted voluntarily by 6 major airlines and mandated by federal regulation for all others. More importantly, a generation of airport workers had been trained to see passengers as people deserving respect rather than problems requiring management. The cultural shift extended beyond policies and procedures to fundamental assumptions about power, service, and dignity. Elena returned to her surgical practice, where she saved lives with the same precision she'd brought to demanding accountability at Gate K-12. But she often spoke to medical students about the importance of institutional thinking, how individual competence meant nothing if institutional cultures enabled discrimination. Her hospital had implemented its own version of bias training, reducing disparities in patient care that had persisted for decades. Jennifer Walsh completed her court-ordered community service and bias training, eventually finding employment with a small regional airline where her supervision was intensive and her authority limited. She never spoke publicly about the incident, but coworkers reported that she treated passengers with mechanical politeness that suggested compliance rather than conversion. Some change is behavioral rather than heartfelt, but behavioral change still protects people from harm. David Miller faced federal charges for falsifying discrimination reports and received a suspended sentence plus 2 years of probation. He was permanently banned from supervisory positions in transportation industries and worked as a logistics coordinator for a private shipping company. His case became a cautionary tale about the legal risks of enabling discrimination, encouraging other supervisors to take bias complaints seriously rather than dismissing them reflexively. Patricia Williams was promoted to Chief Executive Officer of Pacific Airways, becoming the first African-American woman to lead a major airline. Under her leadership, the company's customer satisfaction ratings reached industry records, its employee retention improved dramatically, and its financial performance exceeded market expectations. The transformation proved that treating people with dignity was not just morally correct, but economically advantageous. Miguel Santos graduated with a degree in civil rights law and joined the Travelers Dignity Fund's legal team. His phone video from that Tuesday afternoon had been viewed over 10 million times and was used in bias training programs across multiple industries. He often reflected on how his decision to record rather than look away had contributed to changes that affected millions of people's lives. The broader impact extended beyond aviation into hospitality, retail, and public services, the principle established at Gate K-12. That discrimination would have immediate serious consequences, had been adopted by organizations that wanted to prevent rather than manage bias incidents. The Carter Protocol's emphasis on bystander intervention had encouraged witnesses to speak up instead of staying silent when they observed misconduct. But perhaps the most significant change was in passenger expectations. People who might once have accepted discriminatory treatment as normal airline behavior now understood their rights and had resources to enforce them. The normalization of bias had been replaced by an expectation of dignity, creating social pressure that reinforced legal and policy changes. As the 5th anniversary of the incident approached, James and Elena received an invitation that surprised them. Pacific Airways wanted to dedicate a plaque at Gate K-12, commemorating the transformation that began there. Initially, they were reluctant to participate in what felt like celebrating their own mistreatment. But Patricia Williams convinced them that the commemoration was about honoring everyone who had spoken up that day. Passengers, employees, and advocates who had chosen courage over comfort. The dedication ceremony was small and dignified. Sophia Mendez, now Director of Customer Experience for the entire O'Hare operation, read the names of passengers who had provided witness testimony during the investigation. Marcus Thompson spoke about employees who had embraced cultural change rather than resisting it. Dr. Angela Washington presented research showing measurable reductions in discriminatory incidents across the airline industry. The plaque itself was understated, in recognition that dignity is not negotiable and that speaking up can change the world. Dedicated to passengers and employees who refuse to accept discrimination as normal. James spoke briefly at the ceremony, his words carrying the weight of 5 years' reflection on power, responsibility, and change. What happened here wasn't about individual revenge or corporate punishment. It was about collective responsibility. Everyone in that gate area had choices to make. To speak up or stay silent, to document or look away to enable bias or challenge it. Change happened because good people made good choices and because institutions finally listened when people spoke. Elena's comments focused on the ongoing nature of the work. This plaque doesn't mark the end of discrimination or the achievement of perfect justice. It marks the beginning of sustained commitment to treating people with dignity. That commitment has to be renewed daily by every employee, every passenger, and every leader who chooses to make dignity non-negotiable. After the ceremony, as afternoon light streamed through Terminal 3's windows, James and Elena walked once more past Gate K-12. The boarding process for the 4:55 flight to Miami proceeded smoothly and professionally, managed by agents trained to solve problems rather than create them. Passengers of all backgrounds moved through the process with equal courtesy and respect. Any regrets about how we handled it? Elena asked the same question she'd posed 5 years earlier on their hotel balcony in Barbados. James watched a young family receive patient assistance with their luggage, saw an elderly passenger get respectful help with mobility equipment, observed the kind of normal human courtesy that should never have been revolutionary. "None," he replied. "We didn't just fight back against two people who treated us poorly. We built something that prevents other people from being treated that way. That's not revenge. That's justice." The terminal bustled around them with the energy of thousands of travelers pursuing their own journeys, most unaware that their dignity was protected by changes born from one couple's refusal to accept discrimination as normal. Sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is not hatred in return, but the patient work of building a world where hatred cannot flourish. A uniform is not a license for prejudice. Authority without accountability is just tyranny with a name tag. And sometimes the strongest response to you people is to show them exactly who we are and to ensure that everyone who follows us travels with the dignity they deserve. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. And remember, change doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when good people refuse to look away and choose to speak up instead. Your voice matters, and your actions can change the world, one moment of courage at a time. Thank you for watching, and never forget that dignity is not negotiable.